It is believed in the Buddhist religion, perhaps another, of the pretense of karma. And if this karma exists, then the existence of justice must manifest eventually. And to the expertise of the specific religions, I cannot lend a specific guiding hand, but I might infer to some defects in the common presumptions of these karmic arrangements, as the active engagement of reincarnation dictates that those who are disposed to suffer, which are the primary majority, would be subject to negative karma for their negative acts in a previous life. And this, being its own sense of justice, actively reinforces the position of not dealing with them in an appropriate manner, as to reinforce the function of the suffering in order to facilitate the actions for the karmic retribution which they have merely seen the signs of, similar to in the Bible with Job. And the question becomes, why would he suffer such extraordinary miseries if he had not done some extraordinary evil? After all, he had been an extraordinary, wealthy, important person. How could all of this happen to him in the negative if it was not so that he was in fact not defective? And similarly, the function, according to the religion, from Job's point of view, generates the acknowledgement that it was nothing more than an arbitrary bit, a nonsensical whim, a contest from the proxy war derived by the prosecutor and the judge, and the active position of proving the honorable nature of one is the only actual source of it. And to this extent, you have the mechanism, which is amplified to an extraordinary nth degree, where those who practice sorcery and have engaged in scientific functions which they have kept secret from other parties generates the ability to defraud the general public and subvert the records, actively defrauding even the government, which they would have to be a part of in order to have access to such extraordinary, unique advantages. And being a part of the government, which has the advantage, engage in the subversion of the government by those advantages, defrauds the courts and becomes judge in their own cause, as they severely manipulate the outcome of the total structure, as they generate the pretense to their own specific advantages, and thus the mechanism of the perception that they can do so has made them conduct an active insurrection, where they have postured themselves to be able to say that my policies are the best, and anyone who challenges me must be thwarted and must actively subject to extraordinary war, and thus even the acceptance of malicious collateral damage can be pursued to this end in the war, which allows them to overthrow the general will of the society into dominating it under the hate crimes for these manipulations, and to this extraordinary extent manifests the activities of the hate groups, such as the KKK, to manifest their will through their hate crimes and these frauds against the structure, which they would write into the code of that system which they have dominated, to give them permission to do as they have taken it over and are not its servant. As an insurrectionist, they have no loyalty to the thing they have insurrected against. And to this extent, those who have been abused by these particulars would be as far away from justice as is physically possible, as the actions puts the idea of justice somewhere in outer space, floating well beyond any other context, and to this extent generates the interest or attraction to this cosmic justice, which is the only sense of justice that could be perceived at the moment, as the immediate justice is impossible to obtain, and in this action generate perpetual miseries which would then calculate the actions of the offending parties, which, even if they believe that they are legitimate in conducting these malicious inconveniences, would be facilitating a debt account, which then would stack and be stored in the particular areas to be held to account against them on maturity. And in Revelation, the assumption goes that after the restrainer of evil has been removed, that the society becomes fully engrossed into it and cannot die, and thus the undead mischief derived by pure evil, unrestrained, facilitates its stacking to the sky, as who in what they are, expressed naturally, as the function of lawlessness, the incarnation of anarchy, has become the status quo, as there is no remedy to the Nazi structure, which says that the wizards conducting the abuses cannot be subjugated to the judges or have any particular remedies to the secrets. Therefore, the function continues unerringly to the malice intended, and the abuses conducted for their own sake are then performed into the satanic roles for the rituals, which then progressively empowers their sorcerers exponentially upon the misery of their fellow man. To those who are interested or could benefit or have progressed on the other side, to what they perceive as the demonic correspondence, who would then use the malice from this manipulation to serve something on their part of their world for their services and their own ends, and they, being bound to a service, are paid in their own realm, and thus the mechanism has dissolved, as they, being in some cases not being able to choose whether or not they are bound to a thing, are then paid in the execution of its retaliation according to particular theories, such as the one derived by karma. And to this end, one might imagine that these arbitrary mechanisms would disqualify the pretense of that karmic assumption by the Buddhist in those particular areas, which has overextended the pretense of reincarnation karma, instead of the consideration of brand new karma, as the creation of new karma keeps the cycle going, and the pretense of reincarnation is based upon the assumption that there is no nirvana, and thus the mechanism of continually falling for the action of creating new karma generates its own mechanism of energy, and thus as long as karma exists, the function cannot pass, and the spirit may not settle in a state of peace. And to that end, the karma itself becomes the adversary. And to this, we must presume that the activity requires us to escape from the karmic route of the positives and the negatives, of the heavenly and the hellish. And to that extent, the mechanisms of our participation in the world with powers beyond their recognition, where they accept their own energy to be bound to these new karmas, generates the perpetual cycle of that existence instead of the facilitation of its neutralization. Even if you, being amongst the priesthood, a most holy, noble monk, would, in that action, conduct their activities for the express purpose of your presumed goals, would then generate the karma by having an interest. By noticing the karma at all, they generate the trap of being caught in the current, and like someone who is drowning in the river, they have been taken away by its rapids. And like the river, this assumption must be taken manifest, as the river is derived by water, and water is a function essential to the existence of our organic life. And to that end, the karmic cycle becomes essential to our organic life. And in this action, you generate your connection to the whole by virtue of these activities, but being caught in the interest of the current, you have forgotten the purpose of the source of life. Now, when you are continuing in this activity of discovering old or new karma, you then manufacture the pretense of whether or not you should assist a particular direction, and to the action of conducting the support of old karma, you then are actively resolute into the cosmic order. But in the assistance of new karma, you generate the negative pretense towards your own drowning, as the action of suggesting and reinforcing the new karma against, such as in the Job example, perfect holiness. You, like Job's friends, become the subject of scorn by the source of the holy. And thus, the existence of karma requires the active pursuit of the immediate investigation, outside of taking anything on its face. As the sorcerers, manipulators, lies, fraudsters, witches, and warlocks, etc., have put in it that they might, by their illusions and fraud, create these new karmas as a mechanism of the negative karma derived against them, which then manufactures the mechanism of their self determined importance off of this fraud, and have sustained themselves off of this fraud, which has collectively injured the whole. And those that view themselves as an enemy of that society would then praise the function, knowing what it is, as it is destructive to the society. And those that view themselves as its enemy celebrate it, and to the function of those that have been captured exponentially, such as the pretense of the demon generates the assumption that their having been captured numerous times and summoned exponentially and intended under the service of too many sorcerers, have been corrupted to extraordinary evil, and has assumed the pretense of the destruction of the whole of that society by virtue of having been exploited by it, knowing that all maturity will be paid, is none the less a negative karma generated by having captured it, and the negative karma requires the function of the collective punishment from the generic contempt derived by that malice, having been subjugated to it, is then collectively viewed with the negative pretense, and that negative pretense creates a bill against the perceived collective until it becomes overly credited, and having amounted to a particular weight, then becomes an active intention towards the opposition to these subversive degenerates, and the eradication of those subversive degenerates who do not deserve their attention any further is then retaliated against whenever available on its purpose, and to that extent they are perceived for the purpose of eradication, and thus those that participate in the function of those demons for those exploitative natures generate the negative karma, which then destroys their society. And those that do not engage in these negative karmas, do not summon and bind those demons, and do not create those negative pretenses, and do not destroy their societies, as the function of the retaliation of the tyrannically held slave must obey, and thus its retaliation is derived by the purpose or strength you would have wanted to bend it to your will in the first place. Amplifying it towards your own purpose will then be redirected against those that it would have access to, especially in those who, similar to the other sorcerers, would generate deals or exchanges as they run low on those influences without the extortions, in order to have low contact participation where they trade on the black market particular offenses, one for the other, the tit for the tat, as they redistribute the liabilities, which then do not consume them, as though it was its own weighted product or debt which could be stacked and measured inside wagons and cars, etc., which would then have to burden the participants in carrying them in any particular way. And to this extent, those sorcerers actively seek experts, which compounds those liabilities, which increases the burdens, which creates the retaliations, which creates the wars, which creates the debts, which creates the contamination. In the Bible, it refers to the function of the sins polluting the land as the action against its local demon creates the function of the contamination of the land itself by virtue of the demon's retaliation, and thus the act of having saturated it in the burdensome debts, which we can call sin, can then manufacture its taint on the party, which is then burdening it, which is then distributed wherever it could be, and washed whenever it might be, and to that end generates the perfect malice, until it has been relieved by the retaliation functions under the cosmic order, where the cosmic streams generate the capacity to release those burdens. But those burdens can only be derived by the releasing of those streams if the karma is created. Thus, you must generate new karma in order to have cleansed them, which does not dissolve the function of the burdensome debt, but merely transports it to another, and thus the assumption of its soaking into the ground and contaminating the earth becomes the manifest justification of what very well might be simply secret science and its pollutions, and thus the mechanism of creating secret sciences that you do not understand creates negative actions which burdens from the false experiments which then manipulates the action, which then condemns the ground or rivers, etc. And thus, you might, if you are particularly evil, create such a sustained stain by the demonic in its hatred of the locals that you might even turn a river to fire. Consider the usefulness of the life-giving karma stream, disconnected from that activity. You then could presumably generate positive karma as its own status quo action, such as the engagement of positive commerce, and thus the mechanism of the free market or positive commerce or God's communism for those who are interested in the function of the promotion of the concept of a centrally planned economy, derives to its own end its mutual positive benefits. And to that extent, you've dissolved the negative karma, and thus the life-giving rivers of the cosmic karma generates the reproduction of everyone's betterment. And having sustained themselves from the river of life, have engaged in the function of the exponential wealth generated by the contentment of being able to construct better and better things towards their own interest. But to the extent of the negative karma, you generate the pretense of its own imprisonments and punishments and derivatives, and thus the more negative karma is actively reinforced, the more investments into the mechanism of its solution is obligated to take place, and thus the overreaction generates its own pretense towards negative karma, and the cycle continues exponentially. And thus the mechanism of it not being solved properly currently, pun intended, creates the down the road problematic upon the cosmic order, and thus the generation of the obligation to invest into the negative pretense for that karma generates its responsibilities to those down the river in the karmic mechanism, who then have to take care of the rest of the function of that negative karma. Having collected it exponentially, they must do so in order to have cleansed the karmic river for their positive consumption, but have been burdened with this pretense. And to that action of our lack of consideration for our neighbors down the river, have poisoned the well for their river, and thus have contempted them against us, and to the mechanism of the use of warfare by the function of the river, and our advantage at our part of the river, which has contaminated their part of the river, generates more obligations of labor on their ends, and to this extent generates their natural tendency towards retaliation against the collective society, which has poisoned their waters. And to this extent, you generate the higher investment into the punishment structures, which then consumes the entirety of their society, who otherwise, in the uncontaminated river, would have been perfectly content to ignore them entirely, or have the least amount of involvement in retaliation, or no real dedication towards being a nuisance. In the Japanese religion, there, I believe it was the Oni who could be given a celebration and thrown some beans or something at that celebration, which then gets them to stop bothering them, and thus the low involvement of the action actively makes it easy to appease them, as it is not malicious, it is more mischief, like Marvel's Loki. And to this extent, you have the mechanism of having turned them benign by the use of positive karma, having not polluted their waters, generating a sense of an agreement of peace between the two, which function on several realms. And according to the mechanism of the current um, belief of the CIA and others inside of the American government who have used the military intelligence, have generated the assumption of heaven itself and hell itself as an active ecosystem, which is more accurately expressed as a Feywild. And to the action of it being a Feywild, then you have two things occupying the same space, and the action requires going in between the thing in order to have exited into the play of the Feywild, generating the pretense of its positive dimension, and thus the action of the cosmic river running through them is generated by the vacuum created from the separation of our reality and the Feywild, which then generates the active movement of those rivers of emotional, cosmic, rational activities generated by actions, reactions, etc., as the active movement of the life stream of sorts generates the mixed emotions, which generates the sustained life on both ends, and thus the unpoisoned waters allows for everything to not have a good or to not have an evil, but merely be of another place and another thing and another time, which on its own just tends to not want to be bothered, or has a little mischief or a little curiosity, and nothing really particularly interesting about it concerning the active involvement beyond these mild interests or fancies. And to that extent you generate the obligation from its natural reaction to manifest your politeness towards them in order to not create the obligation of their retaliations. Now, to these extents, you have the active engagements, such as in the United States and its Constitution, by which the wizards and the sorcerers, in their malice, have leveraged war against in order to conquer for their anarchy, to liberate them from God and law and competence and reality, so that they, in their mechanisms, can create a simulation and turn the simulation into its reality. And thus the action of their war efforts put at its core aim to attack the very definition of the rule of law by its extra law, to attack the Constitution, and to violate it in every way, withstanding into creations of de facto law by the sedition against the law enforcement that would restrain them, and in the sedition create the de facto law, as there is no means for the government to validate their core responsibilities. And to these obstructions you have the active interference against the law, which is prohibited by the government and its affiliations, thus the mechanism of its contracts, such as surveillance agents, as a private public partnership, is therefore, in its extension, a violation of that function. And to the extent of the laborious function of the use of the government or its extensions is not permitted to engage in stress that would change human decency or status without due process of law, as the function of the various harassments of the process may not become onerous or taxing against the party as to make those changes by its own state as a punishment or a retaliation, which is normal to the function of factions of political ideal, which engage in these activities under those sorceries in order to gain an advantage against their superiors, who would not have to have otherwise lost the contests of the non-violent engagement, compelling the use of the cheat by the forfeit, which is the acknowledgement that they did not have a claim in the first place. And to the extent that they have to engage in the violence or subversions by the witchcraft, they have admitted to failure on the policy and to not having a position and are disqualified from it, and thus the due process requires the purging of those parties, that the warlocks may not participate in the court, as they have dishonored themselves in their opposition to the law, and thus the function of the service of law in the legal court requires them to have not polluted the source material and has barred them legally, or it is not a due process function. And to this extent, those onerous positions of stresses, such as the hate crimes conducted under the pretense of the office being extorted, so that the equipment can be misused for those private ambitions in the witchcraft for the black market, activates the function of specifically prohibited materials, requiring the full retaliation of the law and the subjugation of the witch, and to this end generates the just compensation for the violation in question. And to that action the war of attrition leveraged against the general public by the Confederate scourge is mandatory under that pretense, generating the obligation of the observation of the obstruction of contracts, such as the functional stabilizing of an education, which would be undermined under the Constitution, which was supposed to protect it, and thus the function of their malice, and to the extension of its education then matures into its normal function in society in its work product, which generates work contracts, and the prosperity derived by the work contracts for a wageable or individual profiting as self-employed benefit derived by the activities derived by that work from that education materializes into the profits that would sustain the party in their human decency, and thus sustain them in their status, and thus in the restraints thereof generate a false pretense for the theft of the property prohibited by law. And they engaged in their armed robberies or theft by trickeries, engage in all kinds of subversive activities, such as the mechanism of engaging in fraudulent paperwork, which cannot be paid immediately or is directly misrepresented, and thus engages in the hyper likelihood, under gross negligence, of the malicious person's intention for it to not be satisfied properly, so that they have the fake excuse in order to have taken it, and thus the mechanism of the fraudulent seizure of property, such as houses, such as cars, such as essential equipment, which then could be repurposed for the function of the stealer to engage in the resources or in the selling of the resources, uh, in order to make funding of their particular departments as they redistribute the wealth under the socialist position of the government established incomes or economy or status, and to the redistribution according that mechanism generates the permanent parasitic function, which can permanently injure the generic society, which is then collapsed into those who then hyper accelerate that function and turn it into the entire business of towns to sustain themselves off of the punishment of those crimes which may not have otherwise been considered crimes because of the sorcerer's entrapment mechanism. To its own extent, therefore, you must observe what has been poisoned according to the well in the consumption of resources, lest you be poisoned by its existence and are led into criminal sins in order to degenerate yourself by the transformation of your body in conformity to the poisons. And thus, if you engage in these activities, you might perhaps perceive the advantage of an inheritance by the white supremacists, which then have profited off of all kinds of evil, deriving the criminal operations as they are scheming degenerates, criminals. All of their profits are therefore poisons, or tainted, or subversive, and thus the action of taking in the poison is then consuming the function of poison. And if you do not understand the activity of the poison, which is a part of the higher occult knowledge on the function of magic, to have them consume it as an inheritance without knowledge, this does not change the function of its reality, merely the conscience of the participant consuming the food sacrificed to idols. And to the action of having consumed the food sacrificed to idols, you then must subjugate it to God, who, in the acknowledgement of his superiority for the existence of a cosmic order and law, generates the responsibility of distribution back to its correct source, and thus no longer receiving the benefits of the criminal magic, have purified yourself in the action and has engaged in the function of the service in the burden of having provided the remedy, and thus those who have an issue with their brother for some debt or conflict, then must, according to God, lest they become contemptible and become rejected for their subversive malice, contaminating the relationship with God, must put off their sacrifices to God and must pursue their brother and engagements of those debts and make a quick settlement of those debts that they might return and engage in the activity of the worship and its sacrifice, as the function of sacrificing the tainted resource to God is then contemptible, as you have given him poison and not the best of the resource. In the Bible, the function of the sacrifices requires a perfect sacrifice, such as a unblemished lamb. And in that activity of the perfect animal being sacrificed for the consumption, where God shares a portion of it with the various participants, which sustains the priesthood, you actively have engaged in the function which he has ordered for the activity in the maintenance and perpetuity of his will inside the society, and thus has sustained the justification of his presence. And in this action, if you have conducted the poisonous taint derived by those criminal activities, such as the activities of Saul when he engaged in war with Israel's enemy and was told to holistically annihilate them by God's prophet. And he said, upon maturity, that he should keep the king as a ransom, and that he should keep the best of the livestock as a sacrifice to God. God says that obedience is better than sacrifice, and that he has found Saul contemptible, and must be removed from the kingdom as its king, and thus end his posterity derivative of his superior nobility according to the original agreement with Samuel. And this original agreement generates the rejection of his purpose in the general society. And thus the activity is likewise the same in the modern times, when they consume the benefits of those criminal operations, they participate in those crimes. And in the action of participation with those crimes, they become contemptible before the Lord, and thus must pray to have it covered. And thus, the action of asking for forgiveness requires compliance and service to God. They may not keep the thing that they ask for forgiveness for having stolen, and thus the action of having stolen it, if they pretend in their mind that they ask for forgiveness while they keep the thing that is stolen, they then mock God, and no benefit is derivative to them, as they are consuming resources sacrificed to idols. The function of the satanic worship by the white supremacist wizards have contaminated the thing, and it has become holistically gross before God, which has rejected them for its consumption, and they must repent before the Lord, and he will hear them, and in their humility he will heal their lands. And thus the mechanism of the traumas derivative of the consumption of those sins requires the repentance, requires the corrections, and thus a remedy to a secret. And thus the blood of the abused cries out to the Lord, generating his demand for compensation. And thus the just engagement of the study of that compensation must be put into its proper order and create its own mechanisms by which the remedy might be transferred in good faith, purifying the thing before the Lord, allowing for the prayers to sanctify it and to turn it from corruptible into incorruptible, and in the mechanism allows the thing to be consumed in good faith according to the proper order without contentment, ending the cycle of the creation of new negative karmas, actively reinforced by the mechanism of the white supremacist magic, asserting the false pretense of the justification of having tolerated them, for having been celebrated exclusively as a con artist, unfit to exist in society, not able to sustain themselves without the thefts which have corrupted their souls and have tainted them to become repulsive.